Mental illness is something we've known about for a very long time, and just like with physical illness, the past is a good place to look for the wrong ways to help people. One of the oldest appearances we know of was in ancient Egypt, referring to the illness of hysteria in women. Hysteria caused a lot of different physical symptoms, but for no apparent reason. The Egyptians thought it was a result of the woman's uterus wandering through the body and interfering with other organs. They, along with the Greeks, thought that it was curable by trying to lure the uterus back into place with pleasant smelling smoke. Although blowing smoke up the vagina is pretty harmless, for much of history, the mentally ill have been treated very poorly. We can't forget that it wasn't too long ago some mental illnesses were considered to be supernatural and works of demonic possession. As early as 400 BC, there actually were attempts to try and separate religion from medicine. Hippocrates notably taught the belief that there are 4 essential bodily fluids, which he named humours, and a deficiency or an excess in any of those would be the reason for physical and mental illness. We now know this to be wrong, but looking at our biology was definitely much more progressive than other ideas. Our friend Hippocrates helped other famous philosophers such as Plato to state that the mentally ill are not responsible for their actions, so should not be punished. This was an incredibly progressive theory up until the 19th century. However, the sheer power of religion reversed any progress and kept on preaching superstitious belief. Natural disasters like plagues and famines where millions died actually supported religious movement, and this was because they were easily interpreted as being brought about by the devil. Over a long period of time, and especially in the last 100 years, we humans have grown, and our understanding and care for those with mental illnesses has become much more advanced. But along that journey, we came up with new, inventive, and dangerous treatments using wild technologies we thought could help, but sometimes did more harm than good. Let's take a look back at some of the most inhumane mental health treatments in history. Probably the earliest form of treatment we have found, trepanation or trepanning, is where someone would have a hole drilled, incised or scraped into their skull, with the idea that this would supposedly cure you of headaches, seizures and mental illness. For those that were mentally ill or people who expressed odd behaviour, it was believed that through this opening, the evil spirits would be released and the individual would be cured. There is some evidence that it may have worked in certain physical scenarios such as a head wound, and there is logic to the idea that it could relieve pressure, but there is not much evidence at all to suggest that it would work on the mentally ill, yet still it was performed on thousands of people over thousands of years with many different and barbaric tools. At one burial site in France dated as far back as 6,500 BC, 40 out of 120 prehistoric skulls found had trepanation holes just like this. A lot of those skulls had signs of healing, suggesting that many of those subjected to the surgery survived. And a lot of them even had multiple holes, meaning that clearly the first one didn't fix what was wrong, so they tried again and again and again. Imagine the pain you would experience if someone was drilling through your head with no anesthetic, or even worse, scraping it until it made a hole. It's no shock that a percentage of those that went through this horrendous surgery died, yet the survival rate was actually surprisingly high, so you may have actually come out the other end still breathing. If you did, however, we can only think of the discomfort, infection, and changes in behaviour poor surgery would have resulted in. To bleed or not to bleed? That's the question. That's a direct quote from the American Journal of Insanity in 1854. Bloodletting involves the act of making an incision in one of the veins of the body and letting the blood drain out. If you're lucky, then maybe leeches would have performed the gruesome task. It's another popular practice that went on for thousands of years and one that was actually performed on Marie Antoinette and George Washington. This treatment was meant to relieve the body of the excess of blood, one of the theoretical four humours that Hippocrates thought regulated the mind and the body. Surgeons used bloodletting as a treatment for fever, high blood pressure, and inflammation of the lungs, amongst other things. Sometimes location mattered, a bleed behind the ears to relieve a headache, or a bleed on the temples to help with the eyes. When it comes to mental health, one example worth noting is in 17th century France. A physician named Jacques Ferrand wrote a book on cures for the mental ailment of heartbreak. One such cure included in the book was bloodletting. He noted specifically that bleeding the heartbroken to the point of heart failure was key, and that the opening of the hemorrhoids is the surest remedy. Heartbreak isn't curable by dumping the body of this much blood, sometimes 5 to 10 pints. It was just completely wrong and unfair to those genuinely suffering. The journal I mentioned earlier actually states that bloodletting was a treatment for dementia. This treatment was used for a very long time, and by the 18th century, the practice of bloodletting was adopted to treat the mentally ill in psychiatric hospitals. At St. Bethlehem Hospital in London, nicknamed Bedlam, one patient stated, "The common prescriptions of a Bedlam doctor are a purge and a vomit, and a purge and a vomit over again, and sometimes a bleeding." Today, it remains a conventional therapy for a very small number of conditions, none of those mental illness. Exorcism has been part of virtually every religion throughout recorded history. Ancient Babylonian priests performed exorcisms in a voodoo-like ritual. Ancient Persians were saved from demonic possession via holy water. And per the New Testament of the Christian Bible, Jesus himself performed many exorcisms and commanded others to do the same. Early Christians believed that madness itself was a punishment from God, or the possession of a demon. A well-known passage states, "The Lord will smite thee with madness, blindness, and confusion of mind." If an individual was possessed by a demon, exorcism is what they required. It was popularized in the Middle Ages and was done by a priest in the name of God, who commands the demon to stop his possession and leave the body. Now, it could be as simple as that, but the most dangerous forms of exorcism involve making the patient so uncomfortable the evil spirit no longer wishes to inhabit the body. This could include beating them, fumigating them with bad gases, drowning, or even burning people. Tragically, there are countless examples of would-be exorcists who have killed their patients with these strategies, commonly women and children. The idea of a demon inside someone is as old as religion itself, and blaming possession on those that are mentally ill is unfair and cruel. Many parents would actually bring their disabled children to priests, looking for help in bringing the child back to normality. For those with atheistic beliefs, it seems to appear a treatment that serves no value to helping someone who is genuinely mentally ill. And whilst most psychiatrists agree there is no scientific evidence to suggest that exorcism works, they do acknowledge that not all psychiatric problems respond to conventional treatment, and, just like the placebo effect, it may have potential in those who suffer and are religious themselves. The Church of England today still has 44 exorcists appointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Arguably, exorcism is more popular than it's ever been, if we ignore the Middle Ages. Now, at least some modern priests will consult psychiatrists and physicians first to rule out any legitimate mental or physical illness. The amount of stories of these real-life exorcisms are worth a read on their own, and oftentimes resulted in cruelty, death, or further suffering of the people involved. For much of history, the mentally ill was seen as a domestic problem. If someone suffered, then it was their family or their local parish that was expected to care for them. In Europe during the medieval times, a small percentage of those that were considered mad were housed in a variety of settings. A few towns would put the insane in places called Fool's Towers. The town of Elbing boasted a madhouse called the Toll House, and the ancient hospital, Hôtel Dieu in Paris, had a small number of cells set aside for lunatics. But on the whole, it was unstructured, and there was nowhere specifically dedicated to actually treating the mentally ill. At the beginning, asylums were a way of ostracizing people from society rather than actually treating them. Often they were kept in windowless dungeons, beaten, chained to their beds, and had little to no contact with caregivers. St Bethlehem Hospital in London, which I mentioned earlier, nicknamed Bedlam for its horrific treatment of patients, opened in 1247 and was supposed to be the first institution dedicated to the care and treatment of these people. It actually wasn't until the mid-1700s that marked a period of the worst mental health treatment in these asylums, and they were eventually seen as warehouses for the mentally ill. Asylums were supposed to be more humane than what was previously available, but with an increase in diagnoses, this led to them becoming severely overcrowded, exhibiting increasingly cruel behaviour towards patients. These insane asylums turned into prisons, where society's undesirable citizens, incurables, criminals, and those with disabilities were put together as a way to isolate them from the public. Some asylums even became popular tourist attractions. Visitors would come and pay to see the deranged incarcerated, and hospital superintendents were glad to have them. Asylums were a place for most of the horrifying treatments, and almost a testing ground for some of the latest advancements in technology and medicine. At times, the environment would be filthy, violent, and cruel with a non-existent level of care, and it wasn't until these conditions were revealed by undercover members of the public that we realised how terrifying these conditions were. One former patient sued the main insane hospital, describing it as the most iniquitous, villainous system of inhumanity that would more than match the bloodiest, darkest days of the Inquisition or the tragedies of the Bastille. For most of history, sending someone to an asylum to treat them was more like sending someone to suffer. During the Middle Ages, witchcraft and demonology were the predominant explanations for abnormal behaviour. The humane approaches to treating individuals with mental disorders were all but abandoned during medieval times. Death was the only logical end for those accused of witchcraft. Now, death obviously doesn't fix anything like a normal treatment, but it's one that was clearly inhumane. The idea of an old hag being a witch was actually a later idea. In reality, a witch could have been male or female of any age, and it was someone who made a pact with the devil and practiced demonic rituals in secret. Although there is evidence some people actually did practice witchcraft, the majority of those accused didn't, and most of them were just picked on for strange behaviour whether they could help it or not. Occasionally the public would try to draw confessions out of people, and apparently the best way to do that was to violently torture them. Unsurprisingly, there were a lot of confessions of witchcraft when being violently tortured, because people will say anything if they're being violently tortured to stop being violently tortured. The witchcraft delusion extended over 200 years and really created unbelievable harm to the progress of science, medicine, and humanity. Involving almost every rank of society, thousands of mental patients were sacrificed, tortured, and most notably, burnt at the stake. Any sign of abnormal or strange behaviour could and would have been seen as the work of the devil and witchcraft. The German Reichland and Swiss states were the worst of us. 100,000 supposed witches were burnt in Germany alone. Although media has made us think that it was commonplace in England, it was actually relatively tame compared to Germany, with a total of 1,000 or so burnings. And that's due to the fact that the English at least had a trial system. The amount of ridiculous reasons for these inhumane deaths were absolutely terrible. One case saw in 1727 a Scottish woman was burnt alive for having used her daughter as a flying horse. In part 2, we will look at the wild and cruel treatments of the 20th century, including the shock therapies and lobotomy. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. In the meanwhile, I've made a few other videos you could watch. You can also chat to me on Discord if you want. A link is down below. Thank you for your attention.